He began building his capital,
Parallel channels,
where
lines.
it was simply not possible
like it
to
all.
build a city. He conceived and designed the capital himself. He rebuilt it many times and forced everyone to live exactly as he envisioned, and no other way, at the cost of enormous sacrifices, on deadly swamps, and under the assault of devastating floods. Russia's first planned city would rise. Along arrow-straight streets, stone houses would stand next to each other in neat rows. The embankments would be clad in granite. Many squares would open up, and the tall spire of the Peter and Paul Cathedral would pierce the sea fog, like the mast of a massive ship that was sailing into the future. Peter the Great's creation, St. Petersburg, would become the main symbol of his transformations. But until his last day, the emperor would never decide to whom he wanted to pass his legacy. It was a fair day. The Tsar was in excellent spirits. They quickly determined the correct location for the bastion and ravelins. But Peter wished to inspect the neighboring islands as well. He was delighted. A true paradise, he said. It smells of the sea. By that time, the Tsar had managed to visit both England and Holland. Their capitals are built on water, and not by accident. Where there's sea, trade flourishes and people become enlightened.
This will be paradise.
It's decided.
Prospect will go there.
Right here, Danilich. You'll build
Here,
me a house.
Build the fortress. Do you understand
Menshikov,
me?
his old
Yes, very
comrade,
good.
had doubts.
There will be paradise.
What house, mein
Here,
Herz,
there.
will drown?
Everywhere.
The Tsar acted as if he didn't hear. And where you're standing, we'll build you a palace. Peter had long dreamed of building a great European city. But as it happened, it was war that dictated the location for construction. By spring of the year 1703, the Russian army had recaptured from the Swedes part of the Baltic Sea coast, up to the mouth of the Neva River. The local swampland was the least suitable place for building Peter a new capital. But a fortress was needed in order to protect the new territories. The emperor founded it on May 16th, or the 27th in the new style, of the year 1703, on the island of Janissary, which in Russian was called Hare Island. It was from this momentous day that began the history of the city of St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg was named not after Tsar Peter Alexeyevich, but after his patron saint, the Apostle Peter. The Tsar himself called the city a paradise in his personal correspondence. The nickname Peter, familiar to us today, appeared already in the 18th century and was first mentioned in von Wiesen's comedy, The Miner. Throughout its history, the city has changed its name 3 times. In 1914, at the beginning of World War I, and amid much anti-German sentiment, St. Petersburg was Russified to Petrograd. Later, in 1924, after Lenin's death, it was renamed to Leningrad. The historic name St. Petersburg was only returned to the city much later, in 1991.
The very first inhabitants of the not yet built city were its builders. Soldiers who had been transferred from neighboring fortresses began the work. Then peasants from surrounding villages, workers, captured Swedes and Tatars. They were all brought to the Neva in organized groups, and for the heaviest work, they brought in convicts. Now, criminals were sent to build St. Petersburg instead of to Siberia. Workers were initially housed in camps, which were temporary settlements of dugouts and huts. As for the convicts, they were housed in the guarded convict yard, which is now the site of Labor Square. Mass forced labor was used only in the first years. Later construction mainly employed hired workers as well as craftsmen, for whom log houses were built. They worked in shifts, 12 to 15 hours per shift, and were on rotation for 2 to 3 months. Wages were exactly 1 ruble per month, while the monthly subsistence minimum was 17 kopecks. Working and living conditions were harsh: constant cold, dampness, unsanitary conditions, and poor nutrition. According to rough estimates, at least 100,000 workers died from disease and exhaustion during the construction of St. Petersburg.
There will be
Peter
paradise, I
didn't think
promise you.
long about who to put in
Get it
charge
on.
of this
Alexeyevich.
construction.
All right. What about
Danovich
you?
had more than
What's going
enough
on?
zeal
Good,
for
good,
10
very
men
good.
or even more.
Your
see
zeal
the
is
plan.
enough
He
for 10
never
men.
asked for favors.
Yes,
Never
that's the
cited
way Peter
circumstances.
Alexeyevich.
You'll get it all
With an
done.
iron grip on
But not
everything.
tomorrow.
Impossible orders
Today.
simply didn't exist for
Well
him.
then, what do you say, Pyotr
Well
Alexeyevich?
done.
Upon appointing Menshikov as Governor General
Well
of the
done, well
future
done.
city, the sovereign
Look.
had no doubt
They've brought fresh timber,
he'll definitely pull it off.
the best quality.
Alexander Danilovich Menshikov came from a humble family. According to one version, he was the son of a groom. According to another, a baker. From age 14, he served in the Tsar's toy regiment, where he quickly won Peter's trust, became his valet, and then became his closest companion and one of the leading figures of the state. The Tsar called him Alexashka, my dear friend, brother and son of my heart. During the Northern War with Sweden, Menshikov commanded large forces of infantry and cavalry, while remaining Governor General of St. Petersburg.
Building any structure in Petersburg required dozens of times more effort than building a structure anywhere in the rest of Russia. The marshy soil was drained by hand, and they dug canals to divert water. The excavated soil was used to fill the lowlands. For the foundation, it was necessary to reinforce the soil with piles, and the piles had to be driven into frozen ground so that they wouldn't float away.
The shifting ground and the vast abundance of water would create problems throughout Petersburg's entire history. Water seeped to the surface, undermined foundations, and washed away cemeteries. Constant dampness contributed to the development of tuberculosis and an abundance of lice. Building the subway in the city on the Neva has always been fraught with great difficulties due to the complex soil conditions. A powerful quicksand, which is a section of liquefied soil, caused tunnel erosion and flooding twice, both in 1974 and in 1995. The consequences were finally eliminated, but only much later, in 2004.
Initially, St. Petersburg was called a naval headquarters, and Peter's stay there was designated in documents as a campaign. Wading ankle-deep in mud under fierce northern winds, the Tsar scrutinized every detail. He checked what he saw against the blueprints. At the sight of the slightest mistake, he would curse so violently that even the seasoned Menshikov's heart sank into his boots.
Troika?
Despite all the difficulties, by the autumn of the year 1703, in a fantastically short time, the Peter and Paul Fortress was erected on Hare Island, which is now the historical center of the city and one of its most recognizable symbols.
The Peter and Paul Fortress was built according to a joint design that was created by Tsar Peter and French engineer Lambert de Guerin. Initially, it had wooden fortifications and earthen embankments. In the year 1706, they began rebuilding the bastions in stone. However, the fortress became fully granite only by the end of the 18th century.
Since 1725, the Peter and Paul Cathedral became the burial vault of the Romanovs. Here rest the bodies of all emperors and members of their families, from Peter the Great to the presumed remains of Nicholas II. With the exception of Ivan VI Antonovich and Emperor Peter II. It housed the secret chancellery, which was a body for political investigation, and in the fortress casemates was arranged a prison, where important state criminals were held. Upon returning to Moscow, Peter hastened to share his extreme joy with Martha Catherine. The Tsar had met her a year ago at Menshikov's house, where the widow of a Swedish officer served as housekeeper. And now he could not imagine life without her. Sparing no detail, Peter painted for his beloved the miracle city that was growing in the midst of Finnish swamps, while she gratefully listened to his every word. The emperor blossomed in her arms. Here she is, his kindred spirit. The construction of Petersburg proceeded at a rapid pace. A battery was built on the spit of Vasilyevsky Island. On the left bank of the Neva, the Admiralty shipyard was laid out, and also a galley fleet was being created. But all this was happening essentially on the territory of a hostile state. Only in the year 1721, after the Peace of Nystad, would the Baltic lands, including Petersburg, be officially annexed to Russia. Meanwhile, the Northern War was in full swing, and the Swedish fleet had blockaded the mouth of the Neva from the sea. No ship would be able to break through to St. Petersburg. The city from which Peter intended to trade with all of Europe found itself in complete isolation, and few people even knew about it. All of this is in vain. Nobody needs this city. I'm so sick of everything. I could hang myself. At the wharf bobbed a merchant ship that was flying an English flag. A miracle! The English captain was puzzled. He had been carrying salt and wine to the trading city of Nynstadt, but he had arrived in some St. Petersburg. Would they perhaps give a good price here? Alexander Danilovich, in his joy, presented him with a reward, 500 gold pieces for himself and 10 thalers for each sailor. Menshikov rushed to write to the Tsar. If merchants are so very eager to come here,
Let us drink.
despite all
St.
the
Petersburg
Swedish
shall be.
schemes, it
And we
means the
shall make
city will
thunder
soon
across
resound
all of
throughout
Europe.
Peter, upon receiving this news, was so delighted that he ran to boast to his dear Catherine.
You see,
He ordered that Russian merchants should be informed that they could bring their goods to St.
Tell our
Petersburg
merchants to
for
start
export
exporting
trade.
goods. You see, it'll all work out.
However, merchants stubbornly traveled to Arkhangelsk, where the English and Dutch arrived by sea. Everything had been established there for centuries. Convenient roads from central Russia to Arkhangelsk were laid out, with inns and warehouses. Then Peter issued a decree ordering the most popular goods to be shipped not to Arkhangelsk but to St. Petersburg. The overland roads leading to the Baltic were completely unsuitable for trade caravans consisting of heavily loaded wagons. A traveler heading to St. Petersburg in the autumn or spring could count several dozen horses that had drowned in the swamp and which were still in their harnesses. Those goods that did make it to the city on the Neva, they rotted in the warehouses of Trinity Wharf, simply because there was no one to sell them to. Foreign ships could not break through the Swedish blockade.
In 7 years, between the years 1703 and 1710, only 3 ships reached St. Petersburg. Only after the Treaty of Nystad in the year 1721 would foreign ships come to St. Petersburg, and they would come in such numbers that Trinity Wharf would not have enough space for mooring.
Meanwhile, due to the closure of Arkhangelsk, Dutch merchants suffered enormous losses, and the question of breaking off trade relations with Russia arose. Then Peter partially restored trade to Arkhangelsk, setting quotas for the most popular goods in a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of St. Petersburg. But within just a few years, the quotas had to be revised yet again in favor of Arkhangelsk. During these years, many Russian merchants went bankrupt, and export trade continued to drain raw materials from the country at dumping prices. Peter did not despair. He knew there's a time for everything. He was building St. Petersburg not for immediate gains. As a Tsar, he was building it for the empire, and as a father, for his children. Sadly, his and Catherine's first daughter died at the age of 1, but their second daughter, Anna, was growing up, and right after the Poltava victory, Elizabeth was born too. Peter increasingly thought about making Catherine his lawful wife. His feelings for her had not cooled over the years. And besides, it was improper for the Tsar's daughters to grow up out of wedlock. But he postponed the wedding. The situation was wartime, and there was an enormous amount of work to do. The sovereign spent more and more time on the banks of the Neva. He personally participated in shipbuilding, affectionately calling the ships his babies. His favorite ship was the 16-gun snow-called Lisette. The Tsar had lovingly named this ship after his youngest daughter, Elizabeth. The Admiralty was within comfortable walking distance of Peter's house, and therefore the Tsar walked to work. He officially held the position of Chief Master of the Admiralty shipyard, and he received a salary of 365 rubles per year. The Governor General of St. Petersburg, Menshikov, worked at the shipyard too, as a shipbuilding apprentice. And he earned 182 rubles per year for his work. In fact, the city of St. Petersburg was already the capital of the state. But the state apparatus moved from Moscow slowly. Government departments opened their branches in St. Petersburg. They were known as field chancelleries. But their heads were near Peter, in the new capital. Thus, the Moscow departments themselves became branches, while the field chancelleries became collegia. Only in the year 1712 did the governing Senate move from Moscow. From that time on, Peter's stay in St. Petersburg was no longer called a campaign in documents. St. Petersburg officially became the capital.
Since the time of Peter I, the country had 2 main cities: Moscow, or the First Throne, where emperors were crowned, and St. Petersburg, the official capital, where the court and central government institutions were located. Peter II moved the capital to Moscow, but his successor, Anna Ioannovna, brought everything back full circle. St. Petersburg remained the capital of the empire for more than 180 years. On March 5th of the year 1918, due to the German front approaching Petrograd, Lenin's government of the Russian Soviet Republic moved to Moscow, and it has remained Russia's capital ever since.
It was in Moscow that sovereign Peter Alexeyevich organized celebrations for the Poltava victory. In January of the year 1710, thousands of captured Swedes were paraded through the streets of the First Throne city. Then came a report that among the prisoners, an officer had appeared who called himself Johann Kruse, and he claimed to be the husband of Martha Skavronskaya, the Tsar's Catherine, and he also told everyone about his wife, who was now bearing children for the Russian Tsar. It was as if Peter's support had been knocked out from under his feet. Even an autocrat cannot marry a married woman. The Tsar ordered an investigation. Soon it was confirmed that the real Johann Kruse had actually died. Menshikov proposed that they hang the impostor. Peter decided to spare him. And in order to discourage other people from talking, he sent him to Siberia to be permanently exiled. He himself returned to the north, to the place where the war with the Swedes continued, and the new city was being populated. The first generation of the capital's residents consisted of service people, from field marshal to private, and clerks, that is, officials, as well as craftsmen and workers who were brought in to build the city. About a third of the population consisted of soldiers from the capital's garrison. There were many foreigners, both mercenaries and prisoners, Swedes and Tatars. By Peter's decree, stone construction was banned throughout the country and was carried out only in St. Petersburg, and stonemasons were transferred here as well. Both limestone and granite were brought from any and all available quarries. In addition, anyone entering the city had to pay a stone tax, 3 stones per cart, each weighing at least 2 kilograms, and 10 to 30 stones from each ship. But there still wasn't enough stone. Peter wanted his paradise to become a proper European city, and he therefore invited experienced urban planners to help out with its planning. One of the first to arrive in Russia was Domenico Andrea Trazzini from Lugano, Switzerland. Trazzini was a specialist in both military and civil architecture. He developed the street layout, authored standard house designs, and he also designed cathedrals, palaces, and other city buildings.
Here it is, Peter Alexeyevich.
Architect Trazzini didn't disappoint.
A house in the Italian style.
Peter Alexeyevich,
When I first saw it
when he
myself,
saw the palace
I
in
couldn't
the
believe my
Italian
eyes.
style,
Look at the windows.
couldn't believe his eyes.
Big windows.
He
solid
rejoiced
panes,
like a child,
lots of
touching
light.
everything with his hands.
And inside,
on the walls were tapestries,
Inside,
mirrors,
Peter Alexeyevich.
Italian furniture,
Tapestries on the walls,
large
mirrors.
windows
I'll
with
bring in
solid
foreign
glass
furniture,
panes.
crystal, gold.
And then, as if on cue, the cannons thundered. The Swedes! And that ended the palace tour. Alexander Danilovich did not get to show off to his heart's content. What a disaster it was, a mess everywhere. The threat of Swedish naval attack persisted throughout the years of the Great Northern War. To protect St. Petersburg from the sea, in the year 1704, Fort Kronstadt, which translated from German as Crown Castle, was built on a shoal near Kotlin Island. The fort completely controlled the shipping channel, and throughout Kronstadt's entire history, not a single enemy ship passed by it. In the year of 1723, near the fort on Kotlin Island, Peter founded the fortress and city of Kronstadt. This fortress city would later become the main naval base of the Baltic Fleet.
Unfortunately, St. Petersburg's location made it extremely vulnerable under Catherine II. During the war with Sweden in 1788, cannon volleys shook the windows of the Winter Palace, and the smell of gunpowder smoke filled the streets. During World War I, in March of the year 1918, German troops came so uncomfortably close that they began the artillery bombardment of Petrograd. In 1941, Wehrmacht troops were already in the 3rd month of war. They were just 40 kilometers from Leningrad, and they put it under siege. However, throughout its entire history, this city has never once been captured by an enemy.
Peter finally introduced his beloved Catherine to his family and to the entire court as his future wife. The Tsar had no time to marry immediately. He was preparing for a campaign against the Turks. Menshikov did not really believe that the sovereign with his violent temper would be tamed by his wife's hands. But it was heartening to look at the happy Tsar. Peter built his new capital according to his own tastes, so his satisfaction would be ensured. He strictly monitored that construction would only use prescribed materials and that it followed prescribed designs. The traditional Russian layout, where the house was located in the middle of a courtyard with service buildings and vegetable gardens, was forbidden. Houses were ordered to be built along the building line and not in the middle of their courtyards. That is, all houses had to stand adjacent to each other, with facades aligned. And a small space for courtyards was allotted only behind the house. This courtyard was built up with other residential and utility structures. And over time, these structures grew taller and taller. This is how the famous St. Petersburg well courtyards came into being. The difference from Moscow can still be felt today. Muscovites are used to front gardens and small parks and courtyards, and they call the house entrance a podezd, because carriages could drive up to the entrance. Petersburgers call this paradno, because all the old houses also have a back entrance that is accessible from the courtyard. Previously, food vendors would enter through it, and they would go straight into the kitchen. Provisions in St. Petersburg were sold not on every corner, as in Moscow, but in specialized markets. Groceries and fresh products at the Mitny Dvor. Fish and meat in separate rows. The fish and meat markets, all with mandatory sanitary control. Bread was imported and dairy products were supplied by Finns who hailed from the surrounding estates. Peddlers walked around the city, each carrying a specific type of goods. Stoves with stovetops were installed in kitchens, where meat could be fried in a pan rather than baked, as had always been done before.
Here she is. I want to show you something.
Peter I loved to say,
The Neva is here.
God grant me health, and St. Petersburg
Palace will be right
the
here.
new Amsterdam.
God grant
He
me
showed
health.
everything to his
Petersburg will
Catherine.
rise. A new
Plans,
Amsterdam.
blueprints,
Tiled roofs.
drawings.
Countless windmills. Tall
The Dutch
spires.
appearance of the cityscape came from
Network of
tiled
canals.
roofs,
Shipyards.
numerous mills,
Houses built in straight
tall
lines.
spires, there were about 50 of them, and many canals. The austere and monumental architectural appearance of St. Petersburg that we know today was formed mainly in the 19th century, during the era of Nicholas I, who transformed the capital in many ways. Palace Square with the Alexander Column. Senate Square with the Bronze Horseman. The spit of Vasilievsky Island with the rostral columns. St. Isaac's and Kazan cathedrals. The capital was transformed into a grandiose architectural ensemble in the classical style. Originally, the city was built in the restrained style of so-called Petrine Baroque, and it was designed to be viewed from the water. Peter dreamed of transforming small sailing vessels into the main form of transportation within the city. A private shipyard was available for both their construction and their maintenance. Peter distributed small vessels to the city's residents, and he required them to participate in water assemblies once a week. Just think, St. Petersburg, which is famous for its bridges, and they were deliberately not built during Peter's reign. The only exception was floating bridges or pontoons, as well as drawbridges, only in the most essential locations. In addition, permanent boat crossings were strictly and completely prohibited. This way, the Tsar tried to accustom residents to travel by water. But the plan failed. For several months, the Neva was covered with ice, and during ice drift, the bridgeless islands lost any and all communication. They also had to abandon the original layout of Vasilievsky Island, where streets were to be replaced by a network of parallel canals, lines that would be intersected by avenues. However, the streets retained the name lines. There are many bridges in St. Petersburg, and most of them, as in Peter's time, are drawbridges in order not to interfere with ship passage. Finally, an event that had been awaited for years took place in the new capital. Sovereign Peter Alexeyevich married his dearly beloved. She converted to Orthodoxy and went by the name Catherine Mikhailovna. Anna and Elizabeth, both born out of wedlock, at long last acquired royal status. But according to the law of that time, the right to the throne passed through the male line. The sovereign did not give up hope for the birth of a son, to whom he could pass on without hesitation everything he had achieved during his years of reign. And that is why marriage to Catherine was especially important to Peter. So,
avenue lines will
what had
run
recently
perpendicular,
seemed like
here
bold
and here.
fantasies was finally becoming reality. The city founded by Peter grew and filled with ever
This
more
part is
new
already
inhabitants.
built. Why not?
Unfortunately,
Why?
along with it, grew the number of concerns that fell on the Governor General's
All right
shoulders.
then.
Menshikov
Parallel
oversaw
canals
the
with
improvement
streets
of the
intersecting
capital,
them. We'll call those
cleaning
streets
the
lines.
canals around the
Main road
Admiralty,
will go right through here.
reinforcing
from
the banks of the
Admiralty and
Neva,
beyond.
Very good.
and laying roads. Seeing how the northern capital was being transformed, the sovereign's
You
mood
did
brightened.
everything right. Well
Good.
done,
He
Very
was
good.
very
Alexander.
Thank
generous
you.
with rewards for Alexander Danilovich. The main entrance road to St. Petersburg became the so-called Nevsky Proseka, from the Alexander Nevsky Monastery to the Admiralty. The perfectly straight road was laid through forest and swamps, by monks of the monastery as well as Swedish prisoners, paved with stone, with 4 rows of birch trees planted along the roadsides. Later, the Proseka became known as Perspective. And then from 1781, it became known as Nevsky Prospect.
Nevsky Prospect is a whole 4.5 kilometers long, which is almost 3 times longer than Tverskaya. And for a very long time, it remained the longest street in Russia. Nevsky Prospect was the very first place in the country to receive street lighting, which consisted of oil lamps with benches placed beneath them. In the 19th century, Nevsky was built up in the style of high classicism, and it became a unique ensemble avenue, the grand facade of the empire. The Soviet authorities renamed it to October 25th Avenue. But a quarter of a century later, on January 13, 1944, the exact day before the operation to lift the blockade began, the historical name was restored. Modern Nevsky Prospect, St. Petersburg's main street, is part of the highway connecting the two capitals, from Red Square to Palace Square, and it is the only street in Russia that, in clear weather, can be seen in its entirety for several kilometers.
St. Petersburg's streets were paved with wood. Wooden planks were laid over logs. The embankments were built on piles, and each pile had wooden planking laid on top. They would be clad in granite only in the second half of the 18th century. And under Peter, the only stone embankment was in front of his summer palace. The construction and maintenance of embankments, as well as pavements and street oil lamps, was the exclusive responsibility of property owners. In addition, everyone had to plant linden trees in front of their house. This is how the greening of St. Petersburg began. In the summer garden, ancient statues were exhibited for public viewing. They were mostly copies, but there were also originals, including the Torrid Venus. Visitors were admitted to the garden in decent clothing only, and all statues and sculptural fountain groups were provided with explanatory plaques. During major holidays, the garden was illuminated, and tables with refreshments were set up, while soldiers carried buckets of vodka along the pathways. Since he was growing tired of military and state affairs, Peter found a new outlet for himself. By personal order of the Tsar, plants from other climatic zones began to be planted in St. Petersburg: lindens, chestnuts, even grapes and cotton, which did not take root well in open ground and froze to death. Peter devoted himself to this passion with fervor, and he started spending less and less time with Catherine. She tried to attract her husband's attention. She sighed meaningfully. She asked leading questions. Finally, she would go off to her rooms in hurt. But the sovereign seemed not to notice. The center of urban and commercial life became the square by Trinity Church, near the wharf of the same name. There, in front of the long building of the Collegia, imperial decrees were announced, and at the trading rows, bids and contracts were announced. Military parades were held on the square during holidays, in which Peter himself invariably participated in his Preobrazhensky regiment uniform. And afterwards, he feasted noisily at the Tavern of the Four Frigates. After each toast, the cannons of ships moored at the wharf fired salutes that made the walls of the surrounding buildings tremble. In the Collegia, window repair was a separate expense item. The window repair was recorded in the expense book as follows, from which during victories and by weather the glass was broken out. The entire city was like his vast estate, where he ruled at his own discretion. And he consistently interfered not only in the professional, but also in the personal lives of his subjects. By order of the Senate, the main police chancellery was formally established. Under the police chief's command were allocated 10 officers, 20 non-commissioned officers, and 160 good soldiers. The police's powers were extensive. They monitored everything, from the layout and appearance of houses to the condition of cesspools. For throwing filth and garbage into the street, the whip and hard labor. And for selling stale vegetables and dead animals at the market, also the whip and hard labor. Merchant scales had to bear an official stamp. Fake scales carried a heavy fine. Homeowners were required to inspect the pavement in front of their houses every single day, and to repair it in a timely manner as needed. Furthermore, the fire service was also under the police chief's jurisdiction. Besides the fire brigade with its pumping engine, a system for fire alerts and firefighting was created. Citizens had to rush to the signal with axes and fire hooks in order to help the firefighters. To protect against fires, it was forbidden to build private bathhouses, only public ones. Homeowners were required each and every month to clean chimney flues, coat ceilings with clay, and monitor the condition of fire ponds. Bread was allowed to be baked only on Thursdays and Sundays, and only if there was no heat or wind. At night, a patrol team led by a sniffer, Warrant Officer Strukov, went around and literally sniffed out those who were secretly baking bread or heating bathhouses. A permanent curfew was in effect, from 10 p.m. in summer and from 8 p.m. in winter. Only military personnel and midwives with special documents could move around the city at night.
The financing of the grand construction project, like the reforms and wars, came from tax increases. Peasants paid 74 kopecks for each male subject. In contrast, townspeople paid 1 ruble and 20 kopecks. The taxpayer rolls now included those who had never paid taxes before, peasants of the north and Siberia, residents of ethnic borderlands and the Volga region. Amazingly, the revenue side of the budget tripled. The army consumed about 3 million a year. And in St. Petersburg, the budget of the city chancellery alone amounted to 162,500 rubles in the year 1722.
Peter Alexeyevich tossed a letter to Danilych. One of the royal relatives complained that the roof of her palace was leaking, so that during rainy weather, it was impossible to find a place to take shelter. Alexander Danilovich was quite surprised. To trouble His Royal Majesty over such trifles? Trifles, you say? I have a whole storehouse full of such trifles.
What's this?
What do you say, Danilych?
Speak! Speak!
Slander, Your
Menshikov
Majesty.
wheezed.
Trifles,
Slander,
you
Your
say?
Majesty. Envious people. I have an account for every kopeck.
Confess.
But the prince
These are
had
people,
his sins.
speak.
He seized
I wanna
lands
hear
and
it.
villages
What
from
do you say,
landowners.
Danilych?
He appropriated
Trifles.
estates that had passed
Get
to the
outta here.
state.
Envious
He
trifles
sheltered
to you, maybe.
religious
I'll show you
dissidents
what
and
trifles
runaway
are.
peasants, charging them fees for
wasn't
living on
me.
his lands. Peter even lost sleep over it. If Menshikov, showered with honors and bounties, doesn't hesitate to line his pockets at the state's expense, then who can be trusted now? Embezzlement and corruption in Peter's time sometimes reached unprecedented proportions. Out of every 100 rubles of taxes collected, at best only 30 reached the treasury. Many were stealing, and far from all could be caught red-handed. Peter established the Fiscal Service, a specialized supervisory body. Its main task was to prevent damage to the treasury and abuses by high officials. At the head of the service was the chief fiscal, who answered only to the Tsar. Chief Fiscal Alexei Nestorov had long been sizing up the all-powerful Menshikov, but his reach was too short. So he began investigating the abuses of Prince Matvei Gagarin, the Siberian Governor-General, who was rumored to be protected by His Serene Highness. Hundreds of onlookers froze in anticipation of the execution. The drumbeat fell silent. Prince Gagarin cast a heavy gaze over the crowd. Not long ago, he boasted of unheard-of riches, built luxurious mansions, and he even was known to throw feasts with 50 courses. But he was destined to die a pauper. Everything he had acquired passed to the treasury by the Tsar's verdict. His wife burst into loud sobs. Peter looked sternly at Alexander Danilovich. Was the hint, he seemed to say, well understood?
Confess! These are people! Speak!
Menshikov, though he fell from grace, avoided
What's the
arrest.
matter with you, Petrusha?
An old friend, Catherine Alexeyevna, almost always took the prince's side. Many years ago, he had pulled her out of poverty and taken her under his protection. And now she was returning the favor to Alexander Danilovich, protecting him from fits of the Tsar's anger. Peter loved Catherine, and this love saved Menshikov for the time being. In the year 1721, St. Petersburg celebrated the Treaty of Nystad. The Great Northern War ended in complete victory for Russia. In Trinity Cathedral, the senators bestowed upon Peter the title of Emperor and Father of the Fatherland. When he stepped onto the square, he was enthusiastically greeted by a huge crowd. St. Petersburg would henceforth become not just a capital, but the capital of an empire. The festivities continued uninterrupted for 7 days, with masquerades, balls, illuminations, and fireworks. And Catherine also became empress. Peter personally placed a crown on her head. It was the first crown in the entire history of the Russian Empire. The festivities of the Petrine era were lavish, noisy, and lengthy, and participation in them was mandatory for everyone. The police saw to that. Masquerade participants were forbidden to remove their masks or change costumes until the celebration ended. In the squares stood roasted bull carcasses, and liquor was poured from tubs and barrels for anyone who wanted it. Warships shook the shores with cannon salutes. At night, fireworks and firecrackers soared into the sky. All of these celebrations followed a very precisely written script, and the decorations used an elaborate system of allegories. For example, a flaming heart depicted the Tsar's heartfelt attachment to St. Petersburg. On November 5th of the year 1721, exactly 1 week after the Treaty of Nystad celebrations ended, all the decorations were washed away. Another flood occurred.
Major flooding in the Neva Delta occurred almost every autumn and every spring. If the water rose between 1.5 to 2 meters or more above the normal levels, the flood became known as a natural disaster. Cannon shots fired from the Peter and Paul fortress served to warn people of extremely dangerous water levels. The flood of 1777 virtually destroyed the summer garden, and it flooded the cellars of the Peter and Paul fortress, disastrously claiming the lives of several hundred people. The flood of 1824 is described in depth in the poet Pushkin's work, which is entitled The Bronze Horseman. The streets turned into canals where galleys sailed in, rescuing people who were drowning. The flood of 1924 was particularly powerful, and people said it was divine punishment from above for renaming the city of St. Petersburg to Leningrad. Only in the year 2011 was the dam construction completed, finally giving the city the ability to protect itself from natural disasters.
Alexander Danilovich watched as water flooded the embankments, and logs carried by the waves crashed against windows and house walls. But what did St. Petersburg matter to him now? After yet another denunciation, the sovereign's patience snapped, and he dismissed Menshikov from his position as governor general. The prince understood. This was only the beginning. Wasn't the fate of Matvei Gagarin now awaiting him? But in those days, Peter was preoccupied with something else. He had received news that struck him right in the heart. Catherine had betrayed him. But most importantly, with whom? Chamberlain Mons, the brother of Anna Mons, who had once been Peter's own lover. It seemed that fate was cruelly mocking the Russian emperor. Mons was accused of bribery, and he was sentenced to beheading. In the margins of the document, Peter wrote, "Carry out the sentence." He no longer spoke to Catherine. He didn't want to see his friend Sashka. Perhaps he didn't want to live anymore. With a heavy heart, the sovereign was returning by water to St. Petersburg after inspecting the Ladoga Canal. Along the way, he saw a boat with soldiers stranded on a sandbar, being overwhelmed by waves. The emperor rushed to their rescue. While saving human lives, Peter fought to the very end, as if he were trying to overcome the raging elements on his own. But this heroic act had fatal consequences. After several hours spent in cold water, his chronic illness worsened. And although Peter realized that his days were now numbered, there was no regret in his soul. He had lived a glorious life, full of heroic deeds and achievements, accomplishments that others could only dream of. He loved, and he was loved. He had good and loyal friends. He knew the joy of victory and the bitterness of defeat. Fate had given him the oh-so-rare happiness of seeing his boldest dreams become reality. He gave himself completely to life, and he generously shared his boundless energy with those around him. And when he met resistance and misunderstanding, well, then he could be fierce and ruthless even to his loved ones. Yes, he spared neither himself nor others, but in return he created a great army and navy, transformed the Muscovite kingdom into a European power, and built a magnificent city of dreams on the site of deadly swamps. And yet doubts persisted. Who would continue his work? His eldest son, Alexei, was accused of high treason, and he died before the sentence could be carried out. The younger one, Peter, died before reaching the age of 5. There remained 2 beloved daughters and his wife. Before his death, the emperor intended to name his heir, but his final wishes remained a mystery. Peter Alexeyevich was fading rapidly, and with him, an entire era was coming to an end. But what he achieved forever transformed the history of the Russian state.